So I think we've all been there. You get caught up in the hype and excitement associated with shopping for your next watch and made a purchase you now realize wasn't the greatest. And while buying the wrong watch isn't the end of the world of watch enthusiasm is a lot more fun when you're aware of some of the common pitfalls. And in this video, I'm going to take a closer look at some of the watches and just buying scenarios you should probably avoid at all costs. We're gonna be looking at 10 different watches that I would avoid. This is a topic that I've seen in the watch space on YouTube in the past, of course, and just kind of want to give my take as well, because I do think there are distinct paths that you should probably maybe avoid, or maybe would be best to avoid, or mistakes that I've personally made as well, that it's always just helpful when going through this buying process. So this video is all going to be about watches that you should avoid, but if you're more about trying to see what's a good snapshot of the market and what are watches that are good to buy, we have recently put together our team just selecting some of our top picks of some of the top men's watches in the industry. I think the list is over 100 watches now, really specific for 2022, covering all different segments of the industry, different styles. So if you want a good jumping off point and maybe buying your first watch and just knowing where to begin, I think that's a great source of information. So I will link to that in the description down below. Check it out on TeddyBaldassarre.com. And while you're there, definitely shop around. TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, and got some really interesting watches to start your collection with. So for the first watch type to avoid, this one I think is pretty obvious. And this is the idea about replica watches or fake watches. Now, this is, for me, probably one of the most obvious ones on this list, but I know there are many people that buy these type of watches. I would not condone it whatsoever for a variety of reasons. For one, it's infringing on trademarks. So basically, this is just taking an authentic watch, their design, their brand, and then blatantly using their brand logo, trademark, and kind of claiming it as your own. And this is, of course, illegal. Manufacturing these watches is illegal. Selling these watches, distributing them, or transporting counterfeit goods is illegal in the United States. So that is something to keep in mind. Different parts of the world is a little bit more lenient, but this is a big deal. And you could face fine, jail time, litigation, and this has happened in the past. There's been examples of it. So I think it's a very obvious thing to avoid, copying someone's work, claiming it as your own, and taking their trademark and identity. That's not a good thing. And also I think about myself, like, would I want to be looking down and just kind of lying to myself kind of every day? You know, I don't think you need to buy this fake watch, because it's kind of just faking to own something that you don't really own. And I just would, for someone that values trying to be authentic about myself, I just wouldn't feel good being able to put something like that on my wrist and going about my day, because I just feel like I'm just starting every interaction that I have with just not being genuine with them. And if I can't be genuine with myself, how can I be genuine with the world? So I think this is absolutely something that you should avoid. And also to keep in mind, for the same amount of money you might buy one of these fakes for, you can get a real watch with its own identity. And I think that will go way longer. And you're talking about this idea of being genuine. I think that will just give you more peace of mind and your whole ability to just interact and be an individual. So now for this next category here of watches to avoid, I have the Homage or Homage watch. So this is a actually debated issue. And I think there are two different types of these style of watches. I think there's some that will take some inspiration, that are kind of walking the line in a delicate manner and still have their own identity, or at least are doing it in some different way. But then you have the ones that I think are a little bit more just on the nose, kind of nasty and gross, where it's just a direct copy. If all you had to do is just change out the logo and have a new watch, that is where I think it starts to get a little bit dicier and things that I would probably avoid. I think this is one step away from a replica when you're talking about this instance. So pretty much everything minus the trademark infringement happening here. And there have been cases where there's also been litigation in this instance as well. So I think this is a rather slippery slope when you're talking about being one step away from basically being a fake watch. I think all you're doing is just changing the logo. I wouldn't recommend that, because I think you can, again, just get another watch that has its own design identity that isn't pulling from elsewhere, or if it is pulling from it, at least they put a little bit of thoughts of putting it in their own words. It's okay to take shared ideas and build upon it. You see this all the time in different industries, people adapting and doing their own twist on things. This happens all the time in music and people twisting things, but the line, it does have a point where it crosses beyond where I think it's okay. And I would just think for most people, if you own this type of watch, you're always just gonna be thinking about, I could have the real thing. There are instances where the watch is gonna be so far out of reach where it might never be possible. But I think getting something that has its own design identity, or at least is not so on the nose about how it's going about copying something else, is probably a better way to go. Next, we have paying way over retail for a watch. Now, I say way over retail. I think it's okay. In some instances, watches become, maybe they are discontinued and things get a little more challenging. There's not that much in supply. So you're talking about a limited edition, or you have the Rolex situation where some are not totally appreciating. But I always think stay patient and just go for the opportunity to buy it at retail. I think where it gets really nasty though is where you're talking about these 3 to 5x the price of retail. That is just insanity to me. Paying $30,000 to $40,000 for Oyster Perpetual, like that is madness. It's just straight madness. And I think you're a crazy person if you do that. Same with Patek Philippe and the Nautilus. I don't think that makes much sense either. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars for these watches that are retailed around $30,000. And that is crazy. The amount of watches you can get for the money there is incredible. I don't think people understand, if you remove the hype, what you could get. I think many of you that are watching this isn't news, but I recently did a review of a Breguet Tradition 7097 and talking about how that watch at the time of recording is at retail pricing less than the trading value of a Daytona. And to me, if you look at that watch compared to a Daytona, it's like not even in the same galaxy in terms of watchmaking that's happening there. It makes that Breguet look like a nice bargain, and that is saying something. So don't get caught up in the hype. I think this is an exercise of patience, and I think that's important to have when you're buying watches. It's not about getting the instant gratification, and I think if you're able to wait, be patient, the payoff is always better, and you end up not making some silly decisions. For our fourth watch type to avoid, we have Unproven Upstart brands. So these are brands that I will just kind of lump together as kind of these upstarts with no track record in watchmaking. They're coming in and they have no interest in trying to make a good product. They're just trying to make a quick buck. You might see them marketed on some of my videos. I don't know. You might see them on Instagram with all these aggressive advertisements. That's not always the case. There are some good brands that still do this. But if you're not able to find any track record of individuals that own it, that have reviews out there, there's no one talking about it, it's just kind of a little bit shady, doesn't all add up. It's just another random kind of copy brand. It looks like something that might be more popular that maybe exists and it's just a carbon copy. The problem is a lot of people that maybe are confronted with this don't actually recognize that it's trying to emulate something that already exists. They just see it as like its individual design that stands on its own. But when any of these type of ideas come in front of you and you're not able to kind of cross-check somebody else that has an experience with that brand anywhere on the internet, that's probably a good sign. Or if you're able to dig deeper behind maybe the advertisements and see that, all right, maybe this isn't a brand that I want to be buying. There's plenty of these, they pop up all the time. If you've not heard about them, probably a reason so. You're probably not discovering the next great upstart brand from a random Facebook ad that's hitting you on your timeline. So have you ever been shopping for a watch and you're looking at different models, especially if you're looking at say like a vintage model, pre-owned model, and you're like, oh man, I really want to own this watch. I wish I could find something that was available in my price range. And you just keep seeing the same prices over and over again. You're like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to keep saving up. But then one day you see one of these watches of this type that just is an outlier and it's priced way more aggressively as a more cheaper alternative. And you're like, wow, this must be it. The stars are aligning. But unfortunately, this is actually our next watch to avoid, and that is the Too Good to Be True watch. I have been here, I have seen these watches out there where you're like, okay, that looks great, it's a good price, it actually doesn't almost make sense, what's wrong, what's the catch? Usually there's always a catch. You always have to ask these questions, is an authentic watch, if you're talking about a luxury watch, if there's an upside to make some money, absolutely, that's a real reality. You have to look at the seller and what's going on. Another thing that often happens is just these crazy redialed watches that totally are going to be just reworked, not original, different parts, especially with the movements. This is probably where typically you're gonna see this the most. It has total Franken movement inside is kind of a term that people will throw around there, using parts from different manufacturers to put something together. Also, does it even work? Has it been serviced? There's a lot of bad things that typically are associated when you see these watches that are priced as outliers compared to the mean of where most of these watches are priced of a specific style. If it's too good to be true, if it looks too good to be true, it most definitely is. For our next watch type to avoid, and I feel personally attacked again with this list, this is something that I have done as well, the watch that causes financial hardship, or at least puts a little bit more stress on yourself than you probably should. It's probably the better way to put it. I have been here, I've bought watches that were probably a bit out of reach for me at the time, but I just wanted to own them, and this happens a lot. I am a big believer that you should not put a burden on yourself when buying a watch. You should be able to afford it, buy it, and not really feel it. or at least it shouldn't impact your livelihood. You have to make sure that you have context on what watches are. I think you have to look at watches for what they are. They're essentially toys and these beautiful, fun things that we can have a good time with and wear on our wrist wherever we go. But that's pretty much it. There are way more serious things in your life that you have to prioritize before you can start throwing money at watches. And I think you have to keep this in mind. Don't be the type of guy that owns a watch and then doesn't have a bed frame for his bed. Like, don't be that guy. What is that? Hey, you own a Rolex, but you literally don't have anywhere to sleep at night, or you're sleeping on a mattress on the floor. I know this sounds probably hyperbolic, but trust me, I know there are enthusiasts out there that are probably like this. I think watches are meant to be worn and experienced. And if you can't experience, if you are unable to experience life because of something you purchased, an object, I think that takes away the benefit of owning the object. I wanna look down at my watch, like what I'm looking at right now, and just be like, I can remember all the things that I did. I remember why I purchased this watch. I don't wanna be brought with this really, I don't know, just unfortunate reality, buyer remorse that comes with purchasing a watch. I want to be able to feel like this is a proud moment when I look down at my watch, so you can't get in the way. I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not gonna tell you how to spend your money, but I think that if you are going to look to buy a watch, you should just basically look at, hey, if I use this money, can I afford it? Do I have that money in the bank? If I actually just set fire to that money in my bank, does my whole life change? If your answer is yes, then you probably shouldn't buy that watch. So just be responsible, be thoughtful. Life is about a game of playing against the instant gratification. And when you do that, you find that you come out the end being even more thankful for what you have. For our next watch type, we have the fashion department store watches. Now, that might seem like a really random loaded term, but kind of what I'm referring to here are when like high-end fashion brands or like department stores just have these watches that clearly are not made to create the best quality product. It's more of just slapping their logo on it and just marking it up like crazy with not really any thoughtfulness involved in terms of watchmaking. And these are watches that might be walking through a department store. There are good department stores that sell, I think, really solid watches, but usually these come with crazy markups. The quality for the dollar amount, not nearly what I think you can get elsewhere. So I think these are watches probably best to avoid. Try to go for the watches that at least have a respect to the art form and what they're creating, and watches that are made to last is really what you want to look for. So something that often happens is certain watches being bolstered up to this hype status or these iconic status based on what they've been able to imprint on the industry with their presence and creation. And then you get these really elevated feelings where people just feel like, hey, I have to own that watch. So that brings us to our next point here, which is the hype or iconic watch you don't actually care about. This is a big point for me as well, because I remember just looking at watches and be like, oh, everybody needs to own that. That's part of being an enthusiast. There's no prerequisite of owning a watch to being an enthusiast. There's no prerequisite of owning a watch to becoming a collector. There's no watch that you need to own. Basically was what I'm saying. There's no watch that everyone needs to own, experience. If you don't like a watch, you don't like a watch. There are great watches. I hear people saying like, hey, you need to own an Omega Speedmaster. Every collector needs an Omega Speedmaster. No, you don't. You don't need to own an Omega Speedmaster. That is not true. It's an amazing watch. And I think anybody that does like the Omega Speedmaster, I get it. It's a beautiful watch. But to say that every collector needs that, I think that's silly. Every collector needs to own a Rolex? I don't agree with that either. I think there's many reasons why not to own a Rolex, and there's many reasons to own one as well. Just because a watch is hyped or iconic doesn't mean that you need to own it, because at the end of the day, if you don't like it, then it's not a good watch to own for you. So that's the important thing. Same thing goes for affordable watches. I think this is actually even more dangerous at the affordable end. When I was getting into watches, there were a lot of like entry-level Seikos, like a Seiko SKX. Oh, everybody has to own a Seiko SKX. At the time, I liked the Seiko SKX, but I don't think it was really me, and I didn't wear it as much. So it was important for me to understand that, and I purchased it, and I was like, you know what, I'm not wearing it as much. And that was kind of the aha moment for me, like, hey, you know, you don't want to be putting your money into things that other people enjoy that you don't enjoy, because that's all that really matters. You have to enjoy the watch that you decide to put on your wrist every day. For the next watch to avoid, we have the alternative when the real thing is in reach. Say you want that Speedmaster, you're on your way to owning it, you have $2,000 saved, and then one just moment you're like, oh, you know, I see this other watch there, it's around $2,000. It's not really fully there. Maybe it's not even trying to be like a true alternative to it, but it's just a watch for $2,000, and it gets you off track from your goal and you decide to buy it. I think this is a huge mistake. I think many people have made this mistake. Watch collecting is very much like life. You have to delay that instant gratification. You have to allow yourself to scale to eventually own that thing. It's like going after a goal. There's no shortcuts. You just have to make it happen. And if you do make it happen, I always find that with a little bit more patience, you always come out on the other side being way more appreciative of doing that transaction and having that watch on your wrist. It just fills you up with joy, honestly, when you're able to reach that goal, because you didn't cheat yourself when going to get that watch. Not by looking elsewhere and finding something that's more of an alternative. If you can't afford the watch, that's a different story, and if you're doing something irresponsible. But what I find a lot of collectors do is they overlook the idea of how much these smaller purchases add up to maybe one larger purchase. And if you do have your eyes set on that larger purchase, you should hold out for the real thing, not for anything as a substitute, because nothing will give you the amount of just fulfillment and the amount of just joy that will come with getting the real thing that you have your eyes set on. And for our last watch to avoid here, we have the investment watch. Now, if you're trying to be a dealer, that's one thing. And if you're trying to build a business in watches, I think that's another thing. I think you want to buy low, sell high. That's an idea. I totally get it. I'm talking more about the collector. And I think about this for myself. I don't care about investment value for my watches. I know that I put a lot of money in my watches, but that's not why I decide to buy watches for my personal collection. I think this is a good idea for a couple of reasons. One is, watches across the industry are going to depreciate more than they are going to appreciate. We're talking about 99% of the time, that's going to be the case. There are 1% of watches that sometimes will go up, but usually there's a lot of things involved. One is, it's hard to get these watches. If you decide to get one, or you are fortunate enough to get one, say like a Rolex as an example, or Patek, if you buy it and you flip it, you're basically cutting yourself off from an authorized dealer, because Rolex, Patek, they don't like having their dealers deal with these type of individuals. So you're pretty much now creating a barrier to ever getting that watch again. So you pretty much cut yourself off from the supply. The other thing that ends up happening is you look at the end sale price and you're like, oh wow, look at the return you can get. But then you don't factor in a few things. One is just the absolute minimum that will come with how to sell the watch. If you're selling it even at like using something like a basic payment processing system, you're talking about like 2.5%, 3% off the top immediately. And these margins can be tight if you're trying to buy something pre-owned and then try to flip it, for example, and see if you can get some money back. So take 3% off the top, and that's on the low end. Say if you're using something like eBay, they take even more off the top, where a lot of people are gonna ultimately go. Are you gonna be able to, with no track record, get someone to wire you tens of thousands of dollars? Probably gonna be a tough thing to get somebody to do before they see the watch. So that's another difficulty. Then you also will have, if you're trying to sell it to a dealer, you have to deal with what they have to do, which is buy low, sell high, and make some money. They have to make profit as well. And when looking at specifically the trends for watches that do appreciate like crazy, most of them had starting prices at retail over $10,000. There have been ones below, but if you look at those unicorns in the market, that's really where they're positioned. The ones that have like doubled, tripled X retail, those are the models. And also, as you're seeing, many of these are coming back down and returning to normal, which I think is gonna be more of the case. I think some of this was very much inflated, and it's good to actually see this come back to earth, because I think that helps everybody. Stability in the marketplace, better buying for enthusiasts out there. But just to kind of conclude this final point, I think investment watches, sure, you can make some money, but I don't think it's the right idea and mentality to have when you're looking to buy your next watch. But all right, everybody, that is my list looking at 10 watch types to avoid in 2022. Do you agree with my list? Are there some other watch types that you would avoid that were not mentioned? Please leave a comment down below. If you liked the video, definitely give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. Really would appreciate that as well. Have you ever made one of these mistakes, and have you purchased a watch like this with this intention and then like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that? Any stories down below might help some other collectors out there in their journey as they're going about this. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.